Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Matt Sherman, Digital Curation Librarian here at Drexel University Libraries, and welcome to our first talk of Open Access Week 2023, hosted by, of course, Drexel University Libraries. Open Access Week is a global event promoting the access to knowledge, highlighting open activities, and promoting actions that will make more scholarly and educational materials freely available to teachers, learners, researchers, and the public. Today, we welcome Dr. Girija Kaimal to speak to us. Dr. Kaimal is Associate Professor, Interim Chair, and Assistant Dean for the Division of Human Development and Health Administration at Drexel University College of Nursing and Health Professions. She serves as interim chair to the oldest creative arts therapies department in the world. Her service commitments at present also include being president of the American Art Therapy Association and faculty senate representative for CNHP. She's a prolific researcher and artist, and if you've not looked into her work, we encourage you to do so. Today, Dr. Kaimal will be presenting a talk entitled Publishing Without Borders, How the Open Access Movement Creates Real-World Impact. Dr. Kaimal will speak to us for about 30 minutes, followed by another 15 minutes or so for questions. So we encourage you to interact with Dr. Kaimal during the Q&A session. If you're in the room, you can ask questions in person. If you're joining us online, please enter your questions during the course of the presentation or during the Q&A in the chat. Or if you want to ask something and not have it publicly in the chat, then direct message Stacy Stanislaw, and she will include that in the list of questions. Now, without further introduction, Dr. Kaimal.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I hope everyone can see me, hear me. Yes? Yes? All right. So I'll talk today about my experiences primarily, and I don't want to imply that I can speak to all aspects of open access, but I'll speak primarily around my experiences and how it particularly helps research and the kind of research that I do. So this is me. And I just wanted to acknowledge whoever did the graphics for this. This was beautifully done. Was it you, Matt?
Yeah, that's our team.
Beautifully done. So I had to have it up here, and appreciate very much this work that you all are doing. My own history is that I grew up mostly in India, and I came to the US in my mid-20s. So I have literally sort of lived in both countries now for equal amounts of time. And I'll come back to this because this is relevant, because one country hosts and is the leader in publications and scientific output, and the other is not. And what this means, what open access means, and the aspect of equity and global scholarship, and how that relates to open access. There's a whole dimension to this, which is really, really important. So who am I? I think of myself as several things. So I am an artist, I'm an art therapist, I'm an educator here at Drexel. I think of myself really shaped by many, many different cultures and contexts, academic, clinical, being of a specific minoritized population in the US, being a woman, and really integrating the arts and sciences. So that image in the middle, that's my laptop on my art studio desk. So I think of myself really as working at the intersection of art and science, which again has implications for open access. All right. So as we are talking, I would love to hear if folks online want to pop it in the chat, what you know about open access and what questions you bring to this session, so that we'll be sure to sort of bring that into the discussion after I finish talking. So the open access movement really began in the early 90s. As the internet was emerging, it was a way to provide access to publications. So before that, it was really, you went to the library, you made a copy, you went to the photocopy machine, everything was hard copy printed. So this movement to online publications really sort of jump-started this idea that, hey, if we can access things online, hey, maybe anyone, anywhere in the world can access it. And I remember, my father's generation, my uncle's generation, talking about how hard it would be to get a paper copy of a journal article. They had to write to the author. Several months later, something may or may not come in the mail. And especially in countries outside the US, the access was even more limited. So imagine if you don't have access to the latest research, it's unlikely you'll be able to build on it. So in many ways, access is a privilege. And this movement really jump-started that. What open access means is that you have access to knowledge, full text, not just the abstract. So typically this refers to peer-reviewed publications, advances in knowledge, but open access can be for a range of things. It could be for book chapters, it could be for books, it could be for other sorts of published products, but mainly when we're referring to open access, it's around scientific knowledge, scientific advancement. You'll see when you search for on a topic, you'll typically see abstracts. Abstracts are available online, but if you click beyond that, depending on what platform it is, they'll charge you a fee, several dollars, to download an article. Now, we might not realize this as much because we're part of a university, but if you don't have access to libraries through an institution, you are actually not able to access all sorts of new knowledge. So for example, even for my department, we have outside supervisors, clinical placements, and one of the things they ask is, can we have access to your libraries? This is a huge privilege. And when people don't have access, they lose out on all the sort of current advancements in our fields. And typically what open access means is you don't have to have a subscription or membership, and there is no paywall or barrier to access the full text. Okay, why does this matter, right? So we can approach this on many levels. We can approach it from a political level, we can approach it from a capitalist perspective, we can approach it from a humanitarian perspective. And I really am most moved always by the humanitarian perspective. So most publishers are commercial enterprises. They are not not-for-profit. So we might be a not-for-profit entity as a university, as a library, but most publishers are not. They make their earnings from fees paid by individuals and universities to access publications, right? So what is happening is that I remember having a conversation with my dad every time I would publish something, and he'd be like, well, what remuneration did you get? I'm like, nothing. And actually, I had to pay them. And he's like, well, what's the point of that? And I said, yes, this is the real problem. We are paying for-profit entities to make money from the hard work and effort put in by researchers and scholars. So there are some provisions from federal agencies. So for example, if you're funded by the NIH, you do have sort of the federal law allows you to make things open access. In Europe, there are sort of more guidelines around this. If you're funded by certain agencies, then you automatically get to make things open access. Why? Because this is taxpayer-funded research. Therefore, the public should be able to access it. But this is an ongoing fight. This is an ongoing issue. And for now, we still have to pay. Most researchers still have to pay to make things open access, unless it's by invitation or a special issue where the editors and publishers have some leeway. Now, the costs of open access can be prohibitive for most scholars and practitioners around the world. And I'll go into that a little bit more. But the end result is that if you're able to get something open access, it ends up really advancing knowledge in the field. Okay, so types of open access. It can be a range of things. So sometimes you can pay the full fee and it'll be open access forever. Sometimes there's partial or time limited access. So it might be that you publish something and it's open access for 3 months. So, you know, better download in those 3 months. Sometimes the editor of the journal has some leeway and saying, okay, I'm going to make 3 articles in the upcoming year open access. And if you're invited, if you're one of the ones invited to do that, you get to have your article be open access. You might also choose whether it's for commercial use or educational use. So typically open access tends to be only for educational purposes. And you might choose as an author, say, okay, I don't care. Anyone can use it for anything. Typically it's paid by authors for now. So we make sure in our grants, when we seek funding, we include funds to pay for open access. Any questions so far? Let me know if I'm going like, no? Everyone with me so far? Yes, okay. Okay. So how does this process work? Typically it works that at the time of submission, you should be aware as a author what the policies are in a particular journal. What are the kinds of things the journal wants to do. So some journals, like the Frontiers Journal, for example, that whole set, and there's like hundreds of Frontiers journals, they're all open access, which means that you should assume you have to pay a certain amount to be published. Should you be published? There's still a peer review process, but you should be aware of the fees involved. Most journals give you an option. So you might be peer reviewed and you get to publish, and you might choose whether it's going to be open access or not. And if you choose not to be open access, it'll still be published. It'll just not be publicly available. And you should all know, as authors, you still maintain the copyright. So you are allowed to give a certain number of copies of a manuscript for free to anyone who writes to you. So, you know, whenever I have someone write to me and say, hey, I'm not able to access this, can you help me? I always first say, write to the author. There's a reason why there's a contact email included in every published manuscript for the corresponding author. You should feel free to write to that person. They can give you a copy. What happens is, once the manuscript is accepted, usually the invoice comes to the corresponding author. And I have to say, like, the peer review process might take months, but that invoice comes within hours of acceptance. And you can make a payment by check or credit card, and then that becomes your payment for open access. You might also be able to divide it. If you have multiple authors, you might decide you can break up that invoice. They do make it really easy for you to pay. They do not make it difficult. And which is why you know that it's a well-run business. You can also make a choice at this point whether you want the access to be for commercial or educational purposes. Okay, so how did it affect my research? And I sort of didn't know a lot of these things. My colleague Trish Shabokis, she talks about we shouldn't say publish or perish, we should say publish and flourish. And I will say open access really sort of helped me in some of this work. This is the paper that I wrote this in 2016. This is my, like, in terms of my citations, this is the one that has been cited the most. And this is actually not accurate. It's much higher than that on Google Scholar. But I made this open access. I paid for it from like my startup fund as a tenure track faculty. And I decided to do that because I wanted to make sure that what I did in this study was available to as many people as possible. It's a modest study. There are many, in looking back, there's a lot of things I would have done differently. There's several sort of issues. However, this was really, really important for our field. We found out in the study that the process of self-expression reduces cortisol levels in the body and reduces stress levels. So more than just self-report, we were able to demonstrate this, that there's something about self-expression that is physically helpful. And we got a lot of press for this. I continue to get like requests for information around the study, even though at this point it's like 7 years old. But it really, really kind of set the trajectory for me. At that time, I was starting out as an assistant professor. It really set the trajectory for me in terms of access. And it made me realize how much, and I get like questions about this from all over the world. It allowed me to understand how important it is that things be accessible online and for free. We might say, okay, $35 for a manuscript. Yeah, it's all right. We could do this. That is prohibitive. That is a prohibitive amount in most other places in the world. People will not and cannot pay that kind of money to access an article. So especially in my discipline, which is not a huge money-making discipline, this was really, really important in terms of access. And it sold me on the idea that whenever possible, I should try and make my work open access whenever possible. It's more like a service to the world in terms of people being able to access information, learn about my discipline, and learn about the work that we are doing. Okay, I went to Google Scholar to see which of my papers were cited. And this is the screenshot of the first page. How many of these, ignore the first one, that is my mentor's book. How many of these on this page do you think are open access?
One.
Do you think one is open access?
Maybe 3.
3? Any more numbers?
If it's over 4, there's a couple in Frontiers.
Nice, nice. She's been paying attention. Yes. Okay, so we have 1, 3, 4. Any other numbers? Any numbers online? Any bids?
All quiet in the chat. They know I'm right, so.
I was trying to read the names of the journals, but I can't read from here. So I would guess maybe 5.
5. So we have 1, 3, 4, 5. Okay, anything in the chat? Any
No.
bids? No?
Someone said, I'm hoping it's a 100% trick question.
Everything on this page is open access except one. And that's actually a book chapter, and I'm surprised that's as high as it is. So the Preparing Urban School Leaders from 2012, and maybe because it's an older paper is why it has so many citations. Everything else is open access. Yeah.
So that brings me a question that how were you able to support the cost of all these articles in open access?
Different grants, and you'll notice I'm not first author on all of these things. So sometimes the costs were shared, sometimes somebody else paid it, sometimes I paid part of it, and also time. So you'll see like the one that is not open access from 2012 accrues citations over time. So if especially since sort of learning and knowledge is moving so fast, you really cannot wait that long if you want to make a real world impact. That's one piece of it. And it's unfortunate. I really, we did something recently actually with the libraries that I was really excited about. We completed a Department of Defense study, and we generated like an educational report from that. That was the required product. And I discovered that the library can give a DOI number to any work product, which is huge. That's a digital object identifier number. So instead of just putting it on our website, we were able to put it on the library website and for free. And there's a DOI number. So that's something to be aware of as well, that not all open access is has a payment associated with it. So you could work with your own university library and see if that is something you want to do in terms of your work products. Okay, so some pros and cons. What I didn't mention in the beginning is that, you know, the open access movement really began with preprints and this idea of archiving knowledge and putting it out there. So preprints are papers that are not yet peer reviewed, but you want to share that knowledge out there. I have a lot of mixed feelings about preprints, and if you've been paying attention to the news around COVID, a lot of preprints were being put out at the time of COVID. Turns out a lot of them were actually not the greatest in terms of knowledge generation because they were not peer reviewed. People were just like throwing things out there. That's still happening. People will put out like opinion pieces and all sorts of questionable research. So I am cautious about preprints. I know others feel very differently about this, but I am not a huge fan of citing things that are put out there without peer review. So as I mentioned, in terms of manuscripts in general, I have paid between $1,800 and $3,800 per article. I know it goes up to several thousands more, especially for medical journals. I haven't published as much in medical journals, so that's not been my experience. But this has been the range that I've usually paid. Again, these costs are set by the journal. It does, and it really varies. And this is where it also gets tricky. So I had mentioned in the beginning that I work at the intersection of art and science, right? So a lot of my publications tend to be in things that are more arts leaning, sometimes more science leaning, and the costs really, again, are different. And the arts leaning journals tend to be less expensive. So I factor this into my grants, and this is harder if you are a faculty member who is not, you know, writing for grants or are able to pull from those sources. So our former dean, she actually set an amount for each department so that folks could make things open access if they wanted to. That's again something we could do as institutions, as universities, to again provide access. Again, I think of this really as a humanitarian issue, allowing people around the world. We have the internet around the world. Allowing knowledge, access to knowledge, I think is like a humanitarian issue. Now, Drexel Libraries last year had a pot of funds that you could apply for open access. And I think it went like what, within weeks, days, people applied and the funds were gone, right? Is that still a thing? Are you still doing the open access thing or?
No, so we did that last year as a trial to see and try to gauge interest in open access publishing and, or maybe rather in getting funding for open access from part of the university. So while we did get to use up all of the funding we'd set aside for that pilot program, there wasn't a ton of, I guess, data necessarily. So we're going to look at it again, I think. But for now, we're not offering it right now. So it was a trial. We'll see if we can do something again.
I remember it went really quickly.
Yeah, we had, so I think we were hoping to find out, you know, were we going to get hundreds of applications, or was it just going to be enough and we could use up the funds? And if I remember correctly, and I don't want to misspeak, so don't quote me on this, but we did get a lot of submissions and used up the funding, but it wasn't like there were a lot left on the table. So the demand, we're still trying to gauge that and figure out what to do in the future.
Yeah, and I remember, I know one of my faculty applied for those funds, assuming they would be published, but then their manuscript was rejected, so that didn't quite work out. There's an element of timeline to all of this as well to be aware of. But thank you for doing that when you're there. That was huge. And know that for some journals, Drexel's already prepaid for some journals, I think, where if you indicate that you're from a certain university, you will automatically get free access. I don't know which those are, but there is something like that. You can check. Okay, so some more pros and cons. Some open access journals can be predatory, so you should be very aware, and anyone who's published will know that you will get emails every day saying, "Dear researcher, we loved reading blah, blah, blah. Would you consider submitting to blah, blah, blah journal?" And but I've gotten requests from the wildest things like, would you want to like submit to something in surgery or something in like automotive design? And I'm thinking, oh my God, I have nothing to do with any of these professions. That's usually a sign that it's a predatory journal, which means they are out to get your money, the open access money, without being a legitimate journal interested in advancing knowledge in the field. So be very aware of that. Some ways to check for that is to look at the history of the journal. Usually predatory journals have only 1 or 2 issues, 1 or 2 volumes. They don't have a long history of publication. They might also be sort of hidden fees, secret fees, where they take your money, but then don't actually publish. And these are things to be aware of. Self-publishing also has hidden fees and pitfalls, so folks should be aware of that. And credible peer review is really, really key. So just because something is open access doesn't mean it's a legitimate or credible journal. So you should be sure about that. And other things to be aware of, sometimes journals might waive fees. So you might indicate you are a student or you don't have access to any funds. So sometimes, depending on the journal, they might give you a discount, especially if you're submitting from lower income countries. Sometimes journals will make an exception and give you a discount or waive fees. And as I said before, you can always share. So the fee is not prohibited. All right. That's most of what I wanted to say for today. I hope this was helpful. I would love to know if there's any questions at this point, and we open it up for discussion.
Anyone in chat, I think you should be able to unmute and we'll be able to hear you if you want to ask your questions that way, or you can type your questions into chat. And I think if anyone is I said if anyone's in chat, you can unmute. I meant if you're in Zoom, you can unmute. I think you should be able to.
I'm interested in learning more stories, example, evidence of real world impact to help promote open access awareness and participation. So as I had mentioned to you, like if the way I see real world impact is in terms of access to information. So there are examples, especially in humanitarian settings, where people were able to access ideas, materials in ways that a paywall would not have allowed. I know in my case, like people have taken my study and tried to replicate it, taken different aspects of the study and adapted it to their particular context. I had an example of a high school student who reached out to me. She was participating in in a science competition, and she wanted to take the work we had done with the military and adapt it to the firefighter population. And she was able to do that only because this paper was publicly available, and then she was able to adapt it and implement the research in her own particular community. That's one example I can think of. And the open access movement is also trying to sort of offset some of the monopoly that the publishing companies have in terms of profits made around publication that really don't go back to the reviewers or to the authors, but really go to the entities themselves. That's sort of the motivation for the Frontiers journals when they started, was to offset this monopoly of publishers. To me, like, that's huge. I'm hopeful that we can move away from this cost model where people can really put things out there in a credible way. And that's what the Sci archive and the different archive, preprint archive sites allow you to do. And there's a lot of like sites where you can, download pirated manuscripts, things like that. But I'm really hopeful we can get to a point where we can publish without this cost burden, both on the authors, or primarily on the authors, and that we are able to share things globally, share knowledge globally. I hope that's helpful. Yeah.
I have a few questions I can toss out, but
Yeah.
spinning directly out of what you were saying there, I've run into many instances of seeing faculty members who love the idea of open access, but never seem to be able to overcome that sort of hurdle to actually go and sort of publish open access due to different sort of pressures within their own fields. How would you be encouraging other faculty members or students, just researchers and scholars, to sort of be willing and able to overcome their concerns and actually make the effort to publish open access?
Yeah, so that's where the preprint movement really helps, because there's actually no cost to putting things out there as a preprint. And there's a few journals that don't like it. They don't like you to have put anything out there. The OUP publishers, they will not even consider a manuscript for review if it's visible somewhere else. But most journals are not that restrictive. So preprints are a great way to get things out there. Even though I'm not a fan, I understand their value. And that's one way to get things out. I don't want to open up the whole library to everybody, but if the library will give you a digital object identifier number, that's another way to get your materials out there. I think maybe like we need, as an institution, maybe we need to allocate, the Office of Research needs to allocate some amount of funds that faculty can tap into, apply for these awards, and then use that pool of funds for open access. We might, lobby as institution with journals that we know we've published a lot in, and they tend to be the science and medicine journals, but I would really say we should have a spectrum of journals that maybe we pay as an institution and say, okay, our faculty should be allowed open access because we prepaid some of this. I really do think we need will at all levels. And each author, even if you've not been able to publish open access, as I said, as the author, you hold the copyright, so you can share it with anyone who writes to you. Yes, you can't put a full PDF out there because you've not agreed to that. But if someone writes to you, you can email them the whole manuscript. So a whole published paper. That's again something to be aware of. Yeah.
Thanks.
I have one question.
Mm-hmm.
I know you are not a big fan of preprints, but would you consider your graduate students are working with you as a way for them to learn how to write a good paper?
Mm-hmm.
Because when they submit an article in a preprint repository, it does give them a wide open perspective and an opportunity for them to get connected with other experts.
Yeah.
So would you encourage your students to start with preprints?
That's a great question. I think I might have already colored their view on preprints. But that might be a great start for a lot of folks.
And I know that some preprint servers have started peer review and at the same time preprints.
Right.
So that can be.
Yeah, that you get your information out there. Sometimes people are also careful, they want to put an embargo on their research because they don't want it out there till it's peer reviewed. So in case someone steals their idea, for example. There's a question here, what is a preprint? A preprint is basically your manuscript as you've written it. And imagine, typically when we write a manuscript, we send it to a journal. It is reviewed, ideally blind reviewed, which means the reviewers don't know who the authors are. The authors don't know who the reviewers are. And you get your feedback after the review. You address all those comments and suggestions for improvement. And then you submit it back, and then the journal publishes. Ideally, the journal publishes. A preprint is that you put out there the manuscript that you submitted or have completed. So you might have something you've written up, but it's not yet submitted anywhere or gone through peer review. That is called a preprint. Helpful? So there's, you'll see there's, it's called SciArchive was one of the first one. There's this archive, which is the Greek letter, for Chi, and then there's a V added to it. You'll see that for a range of professions and disciplines. So almost all disciplines now, especially in the sciences, have a platform where you can put a preprint out there.
You talked how you sort of inhabit an interesting intersection of both science and art.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak a little bit to some of the differences that you've seen within both sides as they've been engaging with open access?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example of the differences between how my husband approaches publication and how I approach it, right? So my husband is in the aerospace industry. And in his case, the advances are in the publications. So even at conferences, people present full papers. They are conference papers that go into conference proceedings. That's another example, by the way, of a publication. And he's always looking at journals for the latest research. Another example, I just read the autobiography of Kathleen Carrico, who was the Nobel Prize winner. It's an amazing book, you all should read it. It's called Breaking Through: My Life in Science. And she talks about how in Hungary, she grew up and studied in Hungary and then came to the US. And she was always pouring through journal articles to get the latest research. That is the standard in the sciences. Everything is in the journal. So you cite, things have to move really quickly to advance, which is why preprints are also huge in the sciences. In the arts, it doesn't move as fast. The number of citations, the sort of advancement in knowledge is not as rapid as science. So this push for citations or number of people who cited something is very different. So even when you look at Google Scholar, for example, I might have 80 publications, but the Google Scholar index is not all that high because I'm not in a very sort of natural sciences field. Things just move slower in the social sciences and the arts. It takes years and years and years to sort of really build and develop. That I see as a difference in terms of,
But so how does that difference impact their adoption or the way they interact with open access?
So imagine you are in a cutting edge science field. Imagine how much one will be cited or how much people can build on your work if it is open access. And imagine how many people will not even see all the cool things you've done because it's not openly available. You really lose out in a very fast growing field if you're not open access. That's why there was so much out there during the COVID time, like because people were frantically looking for a vaccine, right? Everyone was throwing things out. And that's where the preprint thing got really tricky, because now when we look back and when some of those things were peer reviewed, they were a hot mess. But at that time, it was in everyone's interest to be like, all right, what do you got? What do you got? What do you got? What can we build on? It was a crisis, and in that time of crisis, that had value. Even though the science may or may not have been fantastic.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Question.
Yeah.
What is your vision of open access? 5 years from now, 10 years from now?
It should be free, is my vision. Like if something is peer reviewed and the reviewers are doing the review for free, the authors are writing the manuscript for free, I don't understand why there should be a cost and why it should be thousands of dollars. To me, like that doesn't make sense.
Okay, then how would the publishers have something to help publications, because they are not going to earn, they are losing
Right.
that revenue.
Yeah, there's value, I understand there's costs of hosting a platform, nothing is really free. But I don't fully understand why it has to be thousands of dollars. I think if we can even
That's
get the
true.
cost down significantly, that is a huge.
Significant profit making. I agree.
I mean, like Frontiers is a non-profit entity. I don't believe it's making any profits. But for example, like if our library can assign a DOI number, can we kind of host these in a way where there's a donor that is able to offset some of these costs so people can get their work out there? Can we move from this idea of like, you have to pay to have open access? That would be my vision. Yeah.
Are you familiar with open access peer reviewing?
Where it's not blinded.
Yeah.
That's a
Yes.
fun new adventure. Yes.
F-1000 does it.
Yeah. Several. I know like several journals now also ask if you want your identity as the reviewer to be revealed. I think I don't have a problem with that. In fact, I think it'll make everybody a lot more civil. If you're going to put, if you're going to put your name next to your review, you are going to be a little bit more careful about what you say and try to say, is my assumption. I mean, in some of our publications, I know the reviewer names were included in the final publication. Why not? I think there's value to protecting the identity of the authors. I think sometimes that can get tricky just because you know someone, especially in a small field. You might be biased, you know who the author is, or all right, I'm going to destroy this person, or I'm going to elevate this person. And that's why now there's also a lot of AI in reviewing, especially like for some of the initial screening, there is AI assisted elements as well. We are humans, we are very flawed. There's value to both sides. Great question, thank you.
One more question.
Yeah.
You mentioned about during the COVID days, there were a lot of preprints and then something went wrong. Were they able to retract those preprints back, or at least with a note that there is some error or whatever?
There's no accountability, right? Preprints have no accountability. They've just put it out there. Nobody is, it's only peer-reviewed materials that have some accountability. So even like during the COVID time, if you remember, like there were things that were put out, oh, wipe down your groceries. Oh, okay, no, you don't need to do that because the virus doesn't really survive on on top of the groceries. So maybe that was okay too. Like we thought this mattered. Oh, but no, it doesn't really. That's sort of the cycle of science too. And we needed to do that at that time. And I hope they've removed. I really don't know enough about the preprint processes. I have not really done them, but these are just caveats to be aware of. I never cite, like on principle, I never cite preprints because I don't know what I'm citing. No. That's it. I know others love it. Yes, anything else? Stacy, Matt? No?
Can I just ask one more question?
Yeah.
I know the awareness of open access among the campus, among the university administration is not that great.
Yeah.
So how would you encourage, I'm talking about the general university administration, to have them aware about the value of open access, and they need to support faculty and the libraries in that way.
I think what you did, like what you did last year was huge. So if you have any follow-up data on that, just in terms of the number of people who requested it, the number of people who used it, what that meant for them in terms of their citations or impact compared to the articles that weren't open access. Like I think if you all can kind of elevate that to the Office of Research and to the university leadership, the different deans, I don't see why deans cannot allocate a certain number of, certain amount, X number of dollars to each of their colleges and say, hey, this is something folks can apply for. I mean, I'd love to know what your findings were from that initially, because I remember seeing that and I'm like, oh, this is so great. And it wasn't a small amount, like you had several $100,000.
No, it was under 50, I think it was.
It was more than that.
That's
No?
$2,000.
$2,000 per article.
Okay.
And the
I
total
felt like
fund
it-
was not, yeah.
Not
it was
that
a
much,
fairly
okay.
small amount, yeah.
Well, in my mind, it just
But
became much bigger than it
But
probably
if
was.
you think STEM disciplines.
Yeah.
And like for example, Elsevier, some journals are hybrid. Their cost for APCs are much higher. It could be $4,000, could be $5,000, could be $3,000.
Yes. And these are like, yes, those that have print as well as online. Most things are like fully online now. I know our journal, my professional association, we decided to make our journal fully online, and that if anyone wanted print journal copies, they had to request that. And that's another thing, when you make journals fully online, you're not limited by pages, word counts, all of that. All those expenses go down as well. So, yeah. All right. Thank you for having me. This was really fabulous. I hope this was useful, and 4 more talks coming this week, yes?
3 more.
3 more?
I had to count the days, yeah.
Okay.
Tomorrow through Thursday, and I can drop a link in the chat for anyone who's interested in seeing what else we're doing this week. And follow us on social media. We'll be posting, information and sharing lots of ideas that way too.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for the great presentation.